Welcome everyone. It's been a long time since I've made one of these videos, these with vanilla videos, and I thought it'd be a good time for me to get back into it. I took a little bit of a long hiatus, but I'm back right now, starting the new year off strong, and I thought I'd get a little bit back into these simple videos that hopefully will teach a lot of aspiring developers and even some experienced developers on how to use just some basic JavaScript and raw JavaScript. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Today I'm going to be working on a very simple counter example. So today, actually not today, a couple days ago, I signed up for a service, and on this service, it's a nice platform for learning a lot about front end. And I was looking through some of the questions, and I noticed that one of the first questions, sort of a warm-up question, is this counter question, where you're just given a button, and depending on how many times you click on the button, the counter on that button will change. Now, to fulfill the assignment, you only have to do this for a single button, but I thought I'd extend this to 3 buttons, each with their own sort of counter scope. You can see anytime I click on one of these buttons, each individual one will increase depending on the one I click on, and they're not all affected by the same one. The reason I decided to do this is because oftentimes in interviews, you may be asked to do something for one component, but then extend that to multiple components, each with their own state, and we'll see a little bit about how to do that today. So let's go ahead and get started, and let's jump right into the code. All right, so I've come over here to my desktop and I have my terminal open, and from here I'm inside of a directory that I just created called with vanilla that actually matches the same name as the playlist on YouTube. So inside of here I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder. I'll call this counter. Then I will navigate inside the counter folder and I'll open code up with the shortcut here, code space period. And now you'll see that we are presented with Visual Studio Code, and from here we can go ahead and get started. I'm only going to create 2 files. I'm going to create a very simple index.html file, and I'll also create a JavaScript file for us. Now, what we can do in Visual Studio Code is we can actually use a shortcut that is provided to us by an extension called Emmet. You'll actually see if I just type in the exclamation mark, we get this Emmet abbreviation pop up here, and if I click this, we will get an HTML5 compliant, pretty good starting point skeleton for us to work on. So I'll go ahead and save this document. By the way, if you see any of the code switching or changing, moving around anytime I save a document, it's because I have the prettier extension, and the prettier extension can actually watch for file changes and automatically format on save. So I'll go ahead and call this counter, and the first thing I'll do is I'll go ahead and create that button that I was talking about. So let's create a button here, and let's say clicks is equal to 0. All right, so this is really all the HTML we're going to start off with now in the beginning. Of course, we want to make sure that we link our JavaScript. I'll do that with a script tag. Over here, I will put defer. What the defer attribute does is it defers the parsing and loading of the JavaScript file until all the HTML has been loaded and parsed for us. I will set the source equal to index.js, and then we're pretty much off and ready to go. All right, so I also have another very cool extension here that is called Live Server. Highly recommended it. What you can do is just click on this Go Live button down here in the bottom right of your Visual Studio screen, and you will see a server ready to go for you that will automatically update as you make changes to your file. Now, obviously, if I click on this button, nothing is going to happen. So let's go ahead and figure that out. I want to make this very small, and what I mean is I'm going to incrementally add things to this so you can sort of get my thought process. So I think at least what I like to do is I like to make 2 separate screens here. All right, and we'll just go from here and get started. So in my index.js file, the first thing I want to do is I want to get a reference to this button. So one thing I can do is I can just reference this by tag name, or maybe even using a query selector. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's do const button equals document query selector, and we'll just reference it through the button. And if I want to be able to listen for click events, we'll go ahead and add an event listener for the click event. Button.add event listener for click. And inside of here, I will just do a console log. Button clicked. And that's going to pretty much get us already a long way into this question. So if I open up the developer tools and go on the console, when I click this, you'll see it says button clicked. So already making really great progress. Now, I want to, like I said earlier, I want to go through this in small steps. So I think let's say a naive example or something that you might first try and do would be to simply create a counter variable in the global scope of your JavaScript file. This might be okay if you're dealing with a file of this size, although you can imagine that because we have a variable that is on the global scope, any other piece of code can modify that variable. And we don't want to let other people modify the variables that really should only be scoped to this one button. But we'll go ahead with that example anyway and see how far that gets us. So let's see. I'll call this clicks and I'll set this equal to 0. And now what is it that we want to do? Well, anytime I click on this button, right, I want to make sure that I update the counter that's on the text content of that button. Now there's a couple of different ways that we can do this. I already have access to the button, so I can actually just access the property directly, but we can also access the this context on the button right inside of this function and make the modification ourselves. Now, if I leave this as an arrow function, and this might be a little more of an advanced topic, but if I leave this as an arrow function, the reference of this will actually be the outer function, which in this case would be the outer scope. So here we won't actually have access to the button, and we can prove that just by showing what this is. So if I click this, you'll see it's the window, which in this case, this is the outer scope. Now, if I want it to be the button itself, I'd have to make this into a normal function. Right? So if we do this, now we log this, you'll see this is the button itself. So this is kind of a nice trick. I like doing this a little bit better because I think that this plays nicely with this format. Again, I could reference button inside of here as well, but I think it's a little bit strange to reference button outside here and button also inside. After I learned about this trick, well, it's not really a trick. After I just learned more about this, I thought using it inside like this was more elegant. So let's go ahead and do that. So we know that this is the button. So if I console log this.text content, what do we get? Okay, we get clicks is equal to 0, right? Or not clicks is equal to 0, but rather we get the text content that's in there already. So what if we do this? Inside of here, we click on this button, we can say clicks plus plus, right? And then what I can do is I can say this.text content is now equal to, and I'll make this a template literal, we can say clicks. Oh, there you go. I didn't mean to type that in first. I just got messed up there. Clicks. And now whenever we click this, we'll see that the counter goes up. So this is a good first way of getting started. I think it's a little bit naive, but it'll get you most of the way there. Okay, so as a follow-up to this, imagine we are in an interview setting and now the interviewer asks you, okay, let's extend this to multiple buttons. Imagine you had, let's say, 3 buttons on the page and you want each one of them to have its own counter and be able to increment independently of the other buttons. So let's again think of this in a naive way. Let's say this is step 2 and let's see what we can do. And hopefully through this process, you'll all understand why this is not exactly the best way of doing it. So I'm going to do something a little bit different this time. I'm going to create 2 more buttons. This time I'm going to give them each their own ID. Okay. We'll say button 1, ID button 2, and ID button 3. So now we have 3 buttons on our page. Now inside of index.js, what I'll do is I'll essentially query for all 3 of those button types. So we'll just create 3 const statements here. We'll have button 1, button 2, button 3. And similarly, I'll make sure to query each one of those buttons. Button 1, button 2, and button 3. Okay. Let's make sure we have this. So now this should still work the same way. All right, now if I want buttons 2 and 3 to do something, well, you might think, okay, let's go ahead and create 2 new variables for clicks, right? We can have clicks 1, and I'll make sure to update these. And let's again check our work before we move forward. Okay, everything works there. Now let's go ahead and say, well, let's create clicks 2 and clicks 3. Now you might be thinking, okay, so we have 3 references to buttons, we have 3 different click variables, and now aren't we also going to need 3 different event listeners for all the different buttons? If you did think that, then you are right. That's exactly what we're going to be needing to do right here. And I'll also update all these. So now you can see we have 3 references to buttons, 3 variables holding the current click counter, and we have 3 event listeners, one for button 1, one for button 2, and one for button 3, each which manages its own variable. So if I click on 1, you'll see 1. If I click on this one, you'll see another one. And finally, if I click button 3, for example, you'll see its own counter. So right now, we've gotten to the answer. However, it's not the most elegant approach. And I'll follow this up with finally the most elegant way of doing something, and I think a JavaScript concept that everyone should become very familiar with, and move on to that shortly. All right, so imagine you're at the end of your interview, and now your interview says, okay, this is good, but now let's see if we can even improve on this more. Imagine you have 1,000 of these buttons, and now anytime someone adds a new button to this page, you want for it to also have the same functionality, but you don't want for developers to have to remember to always add a new button for every single one of these, right? This seems very sort of tedious to do and not fun at all. So we're going to take advantage of something called a closure. So a closure in JavaScript is a function that sort of remembers its outer scope. And in other languages, you might run a function and the state inside of that function might disappear once the function is done executing. But in JavaScript, if you return a function from inside of a function, anytime you execute that function later, it remembers its environment. It's like it's its own little universe, if you will, that has its own state. Now, one of the nice things about this is you can do something like we're about to do, where you can set a function for each one of these event listeners to reference a single function, and that function for each one of these buttons will remember its own universe of state. However, there comes some slight overhead with that, right? All of this state remembering and lexical environments, those things require memory. So the more closures you have, the more memory you will consume. And nowadays, I'm not sure that's too much of a problem if you're dealing at a scale like this, but it might be something to consider the more your application grows or the more complex your project becomes. So let's go ahead and see how we can do this. So what we're going to gain from here is a lot of dynamic behavior. The first thing I want to do is I actually want to scrap all this, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the original example I had with a single button with no ID, right? So now we have just a single button, and we're going to go back to the original here. Const button equals document query selector button. Okay, now this time I'm going to create a function. I'm going to call it increment click counter. In here, I'm going to create a variable called click counter, and I'm going to set that equal to 0. What I'm going to do from here is I'm going to return a function, right? And inside this function, I will do click counter plus plus, and then I will also say this.text counter, or rather this.text content is the same thing as we did before. So let's go ahead and set this equal to our template literal, and not like this, clicks, and here we'll say click counter. Perfect. So let's look at what we've done here. We created a function that returns another function that closes over, and it closes over because this function references something in its outer scope. So it's sort of like this whole thing just encapsulates this entire function, and it even continues doing so all the way to the root scope. It closes over the entire scope at this time, and it remembers the state, and it will do this for any single button that we add. So check this out. If I now go to button and I say add event listener, and I do click, let's go ahead and now pass our new function, which, by the way, you're going to have to call. This might look a little bit strange at first because typically we pass function references, and you might say, well, isn't this immediately invoking this function? Isn't that a bad thing? Well, this invokes a function that returns a function. So we actually are just passing in a function reference. The result of immediately invoking this function is that we get a reference to a function that will then be executed when we click on this button. So if we just try it for now, we'll see this actually is increased. Clicks 11, 12, right? Goes all the way up as many times as we want. We can refresh this. Everything's cool. Now here's the cool part. Let's say we now want to make this dynamic, right? And let's say we're going to add 3 buttons now. They all have clicks 0. Here's how we can make this dynamic. What we can do is we can say const buttons equals document query selector all. Now we can get all buttons, and check this out. We can say for const button of buttons. We can do the same thing here. button.addEventListener, click, increment, click count. And now check this out. Everything now has its own state. Each one of these each one of these closures will be unique to that button instance, and it will maintain its own lexical environment at the moment that it was executed, each remembering their own state, each being able to manage their own state and remember previous values of click counter. Now, why is this so cool? Now, there's nothing that is inside of the global scope, right? We don't have to worry about anyone messing with this click counter. All the function is neatly wrapped, all the state rather is neatly wrapped into a single function that is now dynamic. And what I mean about dynamic is we can have however many buttons we want on this page, and we're getting the functionality for free. We no longer have to let users remember to add another reference to a button, or add another variable to keep track of those clicks, or even add another event listener. It's all handled for us dynamically. So a simple question like this, you see how we went from step 1 to step 2 to finally now the elegant answer of being able to do this dynamically and with sort of our own encapsulation, if you will, something that closures allow for us to do. So sometimes these simple examples can really teach us a lot. And I hope that by you watching this video, you learned something new today, and especially something that's done in vanilla JavaScript. Obviously, we can expand this and take it out to a framework like React, and the idea is pretty much the same. We won't have to deal with closures so much so like we dealt with here, because we'll just be creating our own components in React, but it's definitely something to think about. If you like this type of content, if you like watching me go through these vanilla JavaScript projects, I'll be doing more stuff with JavaScript and even HTML and CSS. For example, I went through another problem recently regarding the Holy Grail layout, which tends to be a header and a footer, and in between you have some sort of main content, a sidebar, and an aside. And I think that could also be something cool to go through, just general HTML and CSS code. So if this is something you like, if you enjoy, make sure to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned. I'm going to be making more of these videos. I'm looking very much forward to this year to just get right back in the groove of things. And I hope to see you all around. So take it easy and happy coding.